Welcome to Belmont Poetry Night. I'm Monica Korde, your host and the Poet Laureate of Belmont, California. As an exception to the usual, we are meeting on the fourth Tuesday today, but typically we meet on the third Tuesdays of every month to celebrate the spoken word as makers, listeners, and admirers of poetry. We come with featured guests and an open mic, inviting readers of all ages. After gathering for several years at our favorite physical venue, the Belmont Library, since the pandemic, our thriving poetry circle has transitioned to this virtual space, and I'm grateful this allows me to welcome poets and listeners from across the globe. So here we are, making our way into a fresh year of 2024. And I want to wish you all a very, very happy new year. So excited to see all the familiar faces and so many new poetry enthusiasts as well in the house tonight. I'd love to know where you're joining me from. So, as per our poetry night tradition, please share in the chat. And once again, thanks for joining me and zooming in. After the pandemic, it was the first time I was visiting my family in India this time. And while working from there, when I was curating this poetry night in the theme of New Year reflections in poetry, part of me always kept thinking about how short lived these precious moments are, where I'm spending time with my loved ones, eating together, going on walks in the bazaars or by the riverfront that is right across my house, basically making the most of each day I had there. And although I have experienced all of this before, now that I live here and go back to it, I find so much newness in everything that surrounds me, as if I'm experiencing a new life each time I visit my homeland. And this, in turn, brought me another chance to look at the same, the old, the familiar that can nourish us internally. This made me purposefully pause and reflect on all the lives we might live inside this one that we are already living. And then it comes to mind what name to give to something that feels familiar yet new. Well, here's a wonderful poem I stumbled upon that seemed to give a voice to these reflections of mine. And I hope you will take something from it too that sets the tone for how you want to start, not just this new year, but this new day, each moment, every day as you go mindfully inwards and onwards. Even though we are 3 weeks into the new year, I feel this poem is very symbolic and timely and unlike any typical New Year's poem. Written by New Jersey poet Susan Rothbard, this poem is called That New. At the market today, I look for piñata apples, their soft blush yellow. My husband brought them home last week, made me guess the name of this new strain, held one in his hand like a gift, and laughed as I tried all the names I knew. Gala, Fuji, Honeycrisp, watched his face for clues, what to call something new. It's winter, only tawny hues and frozen ground. But that apple bride was sweet, and I want to bring it back to him, that new. When he cut it, the star inside held seeds of other stars. The way within a life are all the lives you might live, each unnamed, until you name it. Thank you. When I came across that new, I immediately fell in love with Rothbard's imagery and the ease with which she employs the Shakespearean sonnet form, inviting us to reflect on an everyday object, grounding us and elevating it from an ordinary idea to a larger, more meaningful way of looking at our life. And the sum of all this, turning it into such a healing experience for me personally. I feel it is the art of mindful reflection, the art of noticing and attention that is needed from us each time we find ourselves at the threshold of something new. And a poet who does this brilliantly and in so many ways is amongst us tonight. I'm so honored to have the Poet Laureate Emerita of Santa Barbara, Perie Longo, as my featured artist this evening. And here's her introduction. Perie Longo likes to say, poetry is my life. She has published 4 books of poetry: Milking the Earth, The Privacy of Wind, With Nothing Behind But Sky, A Journey Through Grief, and Baggage Claim, as well as poems in numerous literary journals, including Connecticut Review, International Poetry Review, Miramar, Nimrod, Patterson Literary Review, Prairie Schooner, and South Carolina Review. Since 1984, she leads poetry workshops for the Santa Barbara Writers Conference, has taught poetry through California Poets in the Schools for many years, and she facilitates poetry workshops privately as well. A psychotherapist, she leads poetry writing workshops for healing and is poetry chair for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. In 2005, she was invited to Kuwait to speak at the university about poetry as a path to peace. A widow, she is hugely proud of a daughter and son and 3 grandchildren, the subject of many of her poems. How accomplished you are, Perie. It's inspiring to be in the same space as you. A warm welcome and such a joy to have you on this first poetry night of 2024. You're still unmuted, on mute, Perie. If you
Technology.
could,
There we
yeah,
go.
now we can hear you.
As I've said to you before, and I will say publicly, it's really just as much an honor for me to be your guest as it is for you to have me. And I watched one of your shows previously before you went to India, and I'm delighted to be here and see some of the people I saw before and some of my friends, poetry friends. So thank you all who've come.
Yeah, it is fantastic to see a full house tonight.
Yeah.
And what would you like to start us off with, Perie?
Well, like you, I would like to read a poem by someone else who's one of
Sure.
my very favorite poets, and probably one of the poets that started me writing at least more frequently. And I loved his work. And so that poet is W.S. Merwin. And celebrating the theme of this evening, I chose the poem To the New Year. With what stillness, at last, you appear in the valley, your first sunlight reaching down to touch the tips of a few high leaves that do not stir, as though they had not noticed and did not know you at all. Then the voice of a dove calls from far away in itself to the hush of the morning. So this is the sound of you, here and now, whether or not anyone hears it. This is where we have come with our age, our knowledge, such as it is, and our hopes, such as they are, invisible before us, untouched, and still possible. Thank you, Merwin. The first poem I'd like to read is one I wrote on New Year's a few years ago. And it's titled Jesusita Trail, New Year's Day. Rain has turned the clay to sponge, feet sink with each step, trail steeper than I remember, more narrow. My chest aches with ascent. I hardly know where I am or who, a stranger. Faces in boulders, scarred with fire's lash, stare as if weeping tears of pitch. Rows of burnt trees, like stalwart soldiers in green boots, claw the sky, guard sandstone cliffs. Around each switchback, the whole range is bared to sea. No oak or bay or chaparral to block the far islands, indigo along horizon's edge. Yet in every hollow, ferns unfold. I push to the ridge, sit. The only sound is the knock of wind against rock. Sun framed in rosy haze, slipping away, I sing to no one. Hallowed be the mud and hidden seed, fresh sprout of sage, the sling of stars. Well, speaking of nature and what got me writing poetry, I think my father was very responsible for me starting to be a poet because he wrote poetry. And I remember him bouncing me on his knee and saying the poem, "Listen, my child, and you should hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." And when I say that, even now, my father comes into my presence. So I have a poem I wrote for him some years ago called Fishing with My Father. He always took me with him out in the boat on those long northern summer nights, and I loved it. Not the sitting for hours under all the many moons and showy lights, but the going. The creak of oars in the locks, like entering an attic of silence, where no one could reach us. Water beads lined up on the edge of the oar, like a string of pearls, before they dripped back into the liquid mirror that held us all. I realize now how many poems I thought up, but never noted in those hours while we stared the bobber down, praying for a catch. I used to play games to pass the time, for it was not the fishing that pleased me, but being with my father in his joy. If I blinked my eyes 39 times, on the 40th, a muskie would strike. That fish, my father's dream, he took to heaven, I think. When I held his arm at his passing, clung to his hand like no fish ever had, he let go, and I slipped off like that. If I blink 39 times, on the 40th, maybe I'll catch a glimpse of him. The next poem I'd like to read is called Watching the Video of the Dalai Lama, and I have to reach for my book to get that. My husband died now about 22 years ago, and this poem was written shortly after he passed away. It's here. While watching a video of the Dalai Lama. Everything I see or hear is about him since he's been gone. This morning, the Dalai Lama says there's so much suffering in the world, he can't do much. With his monks, he sifts colored sand into an intricate design for peace, then sweeps it away. They collect the remains in a small jar, sprinkle a little on top of their heads for tranquility. While I held my husband's hand as ash, like finest sand, all the hard edges of us disappeared with the smoke. I rubbed him on my skin, then flew him into light. Such tragedy, how it takes death to put everything in its right place, how it takes death to perfect a life.
Those were some beautiful pieces, Perry. Thank you so much for sharing those and opening us to a world of so many feelings and emotions. And I really love some of the lines. So many lines have resonated with our listening audience as well. You can see in the chat later on, the chat brimming with all the lines that you've read, and uh, the one with your father in it, fishing with my father. I love that hard but so tenderly woven line towards the end. If I blink 39 times, on the 40th, maybe I'll catch a glimpse of him. And that's what I'm talking about. You're letting go of a moment or a person, and you always think of holding on to that for a little longer. And I came across one of your interviews, Perry, and what you said in there resonated with me very much. That you said that I love the way poetry clears the air. And it's so true. Some things are so hard to put into words, but poetry somehow makes it uh, easier for us to confront it or just to be in that space where emotions are difficult to manage. And here I would like us to take a reflective pause. As a poetry teacher and therapist, I've read that you often like to take a phrase from a poem and offer it to your students or members in your therapy sessions to fill in their thoughts before they write their own poems. I'd love it if you can start us off with such an offering tonight. Uh, I'm always fascinated by how the arts are able to access deeper levels, and would also like to know how similar or different is your approach when you're making your own poems. But if you can give us a poetry phrase or a prompt that you like.
I always love giving prompts or phrases from which we can write. So the phrase I have for you tonight is was said by a fourth grade student when I was teaching some years ago in the schools. I can't even remember what the lesson was, but his quote that began my poem, I will read later, uh, was every time I write a poem, I fall in love with it. So that is your opening line or thought. Every time I write a poem, and then just put in a phrase or a line of what happens or what you feel, and that's it. So you can just start putting things in the chat, and we'll just see what happens at the end and see the various things that you might add to that. All
Yeah,
right.
I have added that in the chat for our audience. And I would love it if you can, whatever lines come to you, if you can put it in caps, it'll be easier for me to find them later. And towards the end of it, if we have time, we can go back to them. But if we don't have time, Perry and I will collate those lines and create a community poem, which we can offer to you later on your emails. So try to put your lines that uh, in capitals, so it's easier for us to see them and uh, take them into that piece. But talking about Perry, how your approach is when you're making your own poems, do you go back in time? Are you looking at other prompts or something that just speaks to you in that moment? How is it that you approach your poetry?
You know, it happens. If I say, okay, I feel like writing a poem and I sit down, that's just death to me. I mean, I'm not going to think of something. So oftentimes somebody will say a phrase or I'll read a poem and there will be a line or a phrase in there that starts a poem going. A lot of times in just talking about poetry, you know, something will come to mind. So that's one way. Oftentimes in workshops that I give with whatever sample poem I've, you know, presented to them, I'll get an idea from that, from another poem. Um, if something happens to me, a lot of times I will think of a poem. It reminds me of an interview I watched. I can't remember the poet now, and they were interviewing. He was a U.S. poet laureate from a long time ago, and they were interviewing him, and he was in his garden and there was a lawnmower going, and they said, well, tell us how you write your poetry. And he said, nothing really happens in a poem. And I thought that was just such a wonderful thing. This lawnmower going, he said, I really can't tell you how I write a poem. Nothing much happens in a poem. So I've never used that phrase to write a poem, but I think I might because it's stayed with me.
Mhm.
So different ways, different ways. I think now I'm going to read a poem from the time I was in Kuwait. How I
Perfect.
happened to go to Kuwait. I wrote an article many years ago about how poetry is a way that we can come to our own peace. I mean, and at the time, I think I was already a part of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and it just seemed to make sense to me. I know when I write poetry, once I do, whether it's good or bad, I don't care. I have a certain peace overcomes me because I have found there was something inside of me I needed to say that the poem ended up saying. And, there's kind of a breath, a release. So I'd like to read this poem I wrote after my experience in Kuwait. So let's see, it's on page 45 in my book, Baggage Claim. Thirst, Kuwait Poetry Workshop. It begins with a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, humans are not our enemy. Out of the silence of writing, she flies to the front of the lecture hall like a raven, black swirled around her head, draped over body, a veil fastened over mouth, ear to ear. Her eyes mirror and shadow at once, beauty and anguish. In her hand, a small scrap of paper like a sail, her words a wind that propels. She reads her poem released when I spoke of how poetry can be a road to peace. How Rumi wrote to greet every feeling as a guest to the house of the heart. The veil that covers her mouth puffs in and out with each breath, a tent opening in the desert between us. She feels hidden, not heard, aches with loss, relatives murdered for war's intolerable gain. When I ask, what can I do? She tears the veil from her mouth. Say more. I have such thirst. Sand becomes water. We drink and drink. Recently, I had a poem published on Rattle some years ago, titled Said. It was one of those poems that it came to me in a dream. And I woke up from the dream and I wrote it down really quickly, exactly as it was in the dream. And I typed it up, and without even editing it, sometimes it'll take me months to edit a poem. Without editing it, I just rushed it off to Tim Green, the editor. And within 10 minutes, I got an acceptance back. He said, Perie, you must have heard my wife and I last night. And he published it. And lo and behold, I think about just very recently, within the last month, he posted it on Rattle again as a bonus poem. Those of you who get Rattle, he'll have his daily poem and then he has bonus poems underneath. So let me see, that's on page 22. Said. A man woke up thinking what his wife said, he said. Or was it he said, she said? Or each didn't say the other said. And he said, I didn't say that. And she said, you did. You said it screaming so loud, the children ran into the street. Neighbors shut their windows. And he said, you're always twisting my words. But there were no words other than said. It goes on like this, gathering saids to set the record straight. The past stacking up like fallen boulders you could never scale. Unaware as soon as something is said, it is fini. Unless, she says, remember when you said, and he says, it's not what you think I said. You misunderstood or else wanted me to mean what you imagined so you could correct me. They go on like this, but all they do are the saids etched in their faces until they don't recognize each other. And she says, I hope you're happy. And he says, about what? That was a very different voice for me.
It was indeed very a very different voice, and I love the way you've played with this concept and the words, and the humor also keeps it so light and fun. Yeah, among so many of your poems, I think this piece really stands out for, like you said, the voice it has and is which is so different.
Do I have time to read another one, or are we going to do the open mic?
No, we do have time for more poems, and I
Oh,
have a few questions for you as well. Would
so
you like to take a question first?
should I read a poem, or do you want to ask the question first?
Yeah, go ahead. Read one more poem for us, and then we'll stop for a question.
All right, I will read um, a poem I wrote about my mother. My mother passed away a number of years ago, and this poem came just really within the last couple of years. Raising Robert E. Lee, and raising is spelled Razing. Essential workers pulley and crane him off his pedestal. Inch by inch, he creaks on the news video, not flinching a bronze muscle. Gaze steadily while the ground roils beneath my chair. No question, my mother levitating, hand raised, shouting, stop, stop. As the story goes, the Civil War branch of her family claimed they were related to Lee. Maybe it gave them some clout. Tack a hero on your family tree, the paler the better, and you're somebody, a blue blood. She get all Southern on us with the makeshift drawl. Now, don't y'all forget. I'd tell her best not to brag about this in certain circles. Today I whisper, it's okay, Mom. Time's up for old Robert E., whatever in or outlaw he may be, great or grand. You'll be fine. I leave out his traitor part. Tell her she's still somebody. Besides, that war is long gone. And then I stop myself. Lee's statue swinging low by now, headed toward a truck bed for storage. The video ends. Just Mother and me years ago at her bedside in the nursing home after her stroke. I'd flown red-eye to see her. She's clasping the hand of her nurse, a beautiful black man, gowned in blue. She introduces him by a name I can't recall, but smiles, holding his hand. My angel, he saved me. Some part of her brain erased that held no weight.
Oh, that was such a poignant poetry, Perry, and I love how you visit memories and come up with these pieces. And poetry can truly glimpse through the fog of consciousness that we call memory. Your poems offer a rich trove of reflections, whether it is an image, a moment, a memory, or a fleeting sensation or story, which I think each one unspools into existential meditations. And some time ago, I read poet Kaveh Akbar, and I quote him. He said, I want to be of service to poetry because I think a life spent in humble, joyful service to that which you love best is a life really well lived. And I would like you, if you
Beautiful.
could speak to our to your first experience with poetry and how it evolved as you came into the service of poetry through positions such as the Santa Barbara Poet Laureate or as a chair to the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation's Poetry Committee, and of course, in your role as the poetry therapist and teacher.
Well, it's a long story, but I'll keep it brief. As I mentioned, my father wrote poetry. Um, and I just sort of wrote, on and off a little bit. I have no idea where any of those poems are, of course. And then when I was in college, I took a poetry class and won some kind of an award uh, from Atlantic Monthly, it was called then. And I thought, oh, that's nice. I thought that was really, good. I was glad about that. And then I left Milwaukee, where I was raised, and went to Long Beach to teach, and from Long Beach to LA. And then I started, going into all the coffee shops, wearing a beret, thinking I was some hotshot poet, and I took some classes, and then what happened? Then I met my husband and got married and moved to Santa Barbara and took more workshops from people like Sharon Olds and
Mhm.
Mark Doty. And and then I went to the Writers Conference, Santa Barbara
Mhm.
Writers Conference, and won the poetry award there that year. And lo and behold, a couple of months after that, I got a phone call and they said, we'd like you to run the morning poetry work, or they didn't have a morning, they just had it. We'd like you to run
Poetry workshop.
the workshop. And I said, oh, I'm not, nobody knows me. It'd be much better if you would I know some really famous poets and I can give you their names. And they said, no, we think you'll be just fine. I said, all right. But I thought I've got to get a book published at least. Well, there was a book publisher in town, John Daniel, and he said, well, send me your poems. And I sent my poems along and he said, oh yes, we want to publish these right away. So he published them. So my first year teaching at the Writers Conference, I had a book of poems. And then how did I get to be, I don't know. I did poets in schools and I did one thing and another. And then, and how I met David Krieger of the Peace Foundation
Mm.
is I took a workshop early on when we moved to Santa Barbara and he was in it. And we we had a good sense of humor with each other. There was this woman, she wrote a poem about an eagle flying. And another woman said, oh, with a mouse in its mouth. And another woman said, oh, that's so brutal. I can't even stand to listen to that poem. And I said, but think of it this way, the mouse flies. And David thought that was brilliant. And he, a few years later, started the Poetry Foundation and asked me to be the poetry chair. And that's how all that happened.
And that's brilliant, Perry. It's so inspiring, your journey, and thank you so much for taking us through it so quickly. I think what I hear in this is that you were constantly in pursuit of poetry, and that's how it kept rolling on. So it's really wonderful to hear how you got into this place where you really wanted to be, and you've worked so hard for it. So more power to you on that.
Well, thank you for that. I never did much about it all. It just all sort of happened. I think when, there's a William Stafford poem, he says
Uh-huh.
there's a thread to your life, and no
Yeah.
matter what goes wrong, whatever happens, don't ever let go of the thread.
Don't let go of the thread.
And
Yeah, I
that's
love that piece.
yeah, and that's why in my bio I often say poetry is my life because I've never let go of that thread, and
Absolutely.
then I went back to school and got my counseling degree. And, that's how I've used poetry therapeutically at hospice and with a psychiatric center. So I
Mm,
just
mm.
I just bring poetry to everybody I can.
Perfect. I would love to come back to that as well, Perry, your work as a therapist, as a poetry therapist. But before that, would you like to share a poem or two? And then I have two more questions for you, but a poem first.
Um, yes, I have a poem called Sacred Space.
I love that
And
piece.
I remember you liked that one. So I every poetry gathering is a sacred space. Um, the pond floats a lotus with a fish of gold. Above, the Buddha chuckles full bellied, all seasons there, and here, laughing like bubbles in the pond. Coins placed in the palms of his hands, and fruit in thanks, tangerine, pomegranate. Up behind a screen of camellias, green bamboo, sits a young woman on a couch, plumped with pillows, a young girl beside her. They resemble each other, looking at the Buddha, the pond, the lotus and fish, giggling like meadowlarks. My daughter and granddaughter, shoulder to shoulder. Wispy and full, mouth to ear, they whisper a secret to each other, a mystery not to unravel in spring. Tomorrow will be something else. Buddha winks.
What a beautifully tranquil piece that is, Perry. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And it reminds me of one of Lucille Clifton's interviews where she says, and she talks about someone asking her, why is it that she wants to heal the world through her poetry? And her response to that was, I want to heal Lucille Clifton. And
That's true.
fortunately, yeah, and she said, fortunately, I am very human, just like all the other ones, all the other humans. So that's how we go on. And I see that same quality of healing in your poems as well. And my question to you is, therapy and poetry have something in common in that they both gaze into states of being, of experiences and feelings that we are often trained to avoid. In your perspective, what is it about poetry that makes it such a powerful medium of healing and expression, especially when dealing with profound emotions like grief, trauma, and loss?
Well, many poets over many years in time have all said that if it weren't for poetry, I wouldn't be here. Poetry saved my life. Many people have said that. Many poets have said that. So poetry of itself is therapeutic, in quotation marks, because poetry heals us on some level. More specifically, when it comes to therapy itself, I love when Gregory Orr said, poetry orders the chaos of the mind. And when you have anxiety or depression or any of these, states that are disturbing, if you can focus your thoughts on a particular subject or a particular word, perhaps, through a poem or something, it really, it does what poetry does all the time. We discover something in it. And so they're very different. There's poetry for the sake of the poem itself. And then poetry therapy, therapeutically, the focus of the poem is the person. So you don't talk about technique or craft or anything. You just get them to talk more about certain lines in the poem. And every time they talk about it and are that focused, it really helps them get to know themselves or to claim themselves in some way and their thoughts. So that's how it's very different.
That's wonderful, Perry. And it sort of poetry becomes a portal for their thoughts and which are unvoiced or hard to express, like we talked about.
And a lot of time we don't know what we're thinking till we sit down and, we may
Yeah.
start with a particular word and our poem ends up, someplace across the world and you're going, how did that get here? It's that wonderful surprise that we never know where it's going. So our own unconscious is our own teacher for
Absolutely.
discovering who we are.
Absolutely, Perry. Well, thank you so much. Another poem and maybe the last question then that I have for you.
All right. Shall I read? Do you want me to read to the rookie woman cop?
Yeah, that's a great piece as well. Please do
Okay.
that. Yeah.
This is another voice.
Yes, another voice. We love that.
Okay. To the rookie woman traffic cop, one dark, not too stormy night made brighter by your row of red lights flashing behind. That's the title. What did I do? You reply, tight-lipped, drove too slow. My husband is laughing his head off out beyond the vanished horizon. Her slow never. You be quiet, I tell him. Besides, you're dead. Things have changed. He used to call me a reincarnated race car driver when we'd be tootling along a remote road singing, Will you still love me when I'm 64? But you don't know this. You look at me with pity, scanning my driver's license. One of the silent generation. Are you on meds? Dizzy? Your tone congealed, winter honey. No sisterhood here, but I don't bite. Hear my husband's advice a lifetime ago when I was pulled over for speeding. Keep quiet. Don't move a muscle. Now I am dizzy. Stars that aren't out sizzle. Thunder shakes the heavens. You look up to see if it's some jet roaring off from the nearby airport, but you don't know it's him with one of his high signs from the next life. It's cataracts, I admit. All those lights pooling psychedelic on the wet road. Slow's better than dead. You slip a nauseous pink form through the cracked window for me to report to the DMV for a road test. I'll lose my license if I don't go immediately. My spine shrinks another inch. It's past my bedtime. You and the backup cop hold me hostage over an hour, validating my license as if I were a criminal. With a little smirk, you taunt, I know you're not an axe murderer. You don't know that either.
What a great piece, Perry. And I love the way you deliver these pieces as well is in a very different voice, which makes it all the more engaging and fun.
Well, thank you. You're such a great commenter, Monica. I appreciate how attentive you are and what a wonderful listener.
No, I think what I love about all of your poems is that there are the hurting kinds as well, and they are so difficult to draw these emotions out. Where you're talking about in several of your poems, you're talking about members of your family who have passed on, but I love how you bring them into these pieces and cherish them and cherish those memories with them. And uh, it's very difficult. I'm sure it's so challenging to work with that kind of a subject and make it so light and meaningful each time. Going on to my last question, uh, your poems invite readers to discover a deeper connection with the self and the world outside. And speaking of connections, I wondered what you think about poetic influences. Whose work across the centuries do you see yourself in conversation with, or you find yourself connected to over the years?
Well, feeling connected to, I don't know, uh, I honor so many poets and have learned so much from so many poets. But I did make a little list because it's the kind of question if you're asked, like sometimes I'm asked it and I go blank. So I wrote a few people down. And Shakespeare, of course, and any of the early
Yeah.
classical poets, we need to read them and study them and
Mhm.
get their music into us. There's a poet by the name of Anne Bradstreet who wrote in the 1600s, one of the few women poets. And I read a poem of hers some years ago, and she had quite a personality. And she wrote a poem of irritation to the critics who said that she did not write very well. And she was
Mm.
a woman after all, and so
Yeah.
that I found her and I thought it was so unusual. She was snippy back in 1600 with her critics. I thought she's my kind of girl, I thought that
Yeah.
was great. Emily Dickinson, of course, all
Mm.
of Emily Dickinson. Elizabeth Browning.
Oh, yeah, I
How do
love her
I
as well.
love thee? Let me count the ways. And I find myself, I find new ways, thinking of the new year, new ways I love people every year and even back in memory. Octavio Paz is a great favorite of mine. Pablo Neruda, Audre Lorde. I think she's a wonderful poet. Philip Levine.
Oh, I love
Oh,
him.
Philip Levine. Um, for years, in the beginning of my poetry writing, we were all writing like Merwin, no punctuation. And,
Mm,
and then in the New Yorker, I came across a poem by Philip Levine called Snow. I love this poem so much. I
mm.
cut it out and I put it in my wallet and started punctuating. It gave me so much more freedom. And it was a wonderful poem because I love the snow and I'd never seen a poem about snow before. And it happened that at one of the writers' conferences, he came as a guest and gave a talk because his brother lived in Santa Barbara.
I see.
So the head of the conference called and said, "Hey, Perie, how about introducing Philip Levine?" And I couldn't believe it. And so I went to my wallet all the years later and I pulled it out and I said, "Well, my introduction to Philip Levine is his poem Snow," and went on from there. He thought that was a wonderful introduction. And so I really liked Evgeny Evtushenko. Evgeny Evtushenko, a Russian poet. He wrote a book of
Mm,
poetry published in the middle 60s.
mm,
It was called Bratsk Station. And it was a book of
mm.
monologues by people who worked on building the first electric plant in Russia. Fabulous poetry. I loved it so much that I made a reader's theater out of it. And then, of course, I had to write
Wow.
to the publisher and I had to get permission to do that with it when I was a student at UCLA.
Mm.
And I fell in love with Yevtushenko. And to make matters even better, he was invited to UCSB many years later. And a friend of mine was on the committee because she taught Russian. So she said, "You can meet Yevtushenko if you want to." I said, "You've got to be kidding me." So I actually met Yevtushenko. He knew who I was because of having to give me permission. And that was a stunning thing. So of course, he influenced me a lot. And Denise Levertov and Sharon Olds is tremendous. She's been a big influence. That's enough.
Well, so many of the poets that you mentioned, Perry, are very dear to me as well, and it's absolutely amazing how the universe comes together for what you truly, your heart truly seeks. And I see that these poets that you met and had interactions with, and I would say and let people know that always put a poem in your pocket, and you never know when the poet might just
That's
show
right.
himself or herself, right?
You never know.
You never know. But on that note, Perry, would you like to share that poem with the poem prompt you gave us? And
Yes, I will. And this will be the last poem.
yes,
Okay.
and we'll close the featured segment here.
Wonderful. Okay, so here's the poem. It's titled What We Live For. And the quote is, "Every time I write a poem, I fall in love with it." An anonymous fourth grader. What we live for, the musk that opens static ducts, and the press of pine needles soft on the small of the back. His eyes full of each inch of you, the breath in, his, the breath out, yours. How the hushed forest awoke when your song scattered the meadowlarks into the blank blue sky. You're quivering the water's pulse against the banks. Then there's the writing of it. How Chinese white pear blossoms catch in the wind like snowflakes, settle on the tips of winter's brown twigs. With your favorite pen in hand, the smooth one whose ink flows gently across the flesh of the page, words start to come, one against the other, small kisses lined up. Soon you're swimming in them, with them. You pull back, they chase you, catch you. Together, you trace back roads of memory as the lover's fingers remind you what is true. There will be no truce until you focus. Give your all. Release. Child, the poem you birthed, folded in your pocket, is what we live for, what saves us, drives us mad. these words we may one day die for.
Simply sublime, Perie. Thank you so much. That was truly therapeutic and inspiring in every sense, and the generosity with which you shared all of your work. Thanks for taking us on a reflective journey of sorts through your poems that have such deep compassion and music and wisdom all welded together with such experienced craft. That is a gift, and we all are grateful for this New Year's gift from you.
Well, thank you, Monica, and thank you, audience. You're very attentive on Zoom.
Well, I'd like to invite a few comments from the audience before we close this segment. So I will encourage those who'd like to say something to unmute themselves. And I'll share a few links meanwhile to Perry's works and upcoming events in the chat. So please go ahead and feel free.
Perie, this is Phil Harris. I'd like to thank you. I'm almost ashamed to admit I'm a kind of a late blooming poet that didn't actually know who you were, and I definitely will know more now because I was absolutely blown away. I mean, because it was everything from this deep, heartfelt kind of love and longing to just smack you in the face humor, and that it just moved me. So thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you very much, Philip.
So, Perie, this is Phyllis,
Hi, Phyllis.
AKA Felicity.
Right. So good to see you here.
It's really lovely to be here. And what can I say to you? Well, that was just a beautiful, beautiful reading. And I loved hearing some of the poems I hadn't heard from you before. And I want to tell everyone that Perie is extremely modest. And so she really wouldn't, and that's a really good thing. But I want to brag a little bit about Perie and just say, how many years have you been? Are you still doing the Santa Barbara Poets every year?
Every year. This year, I started doing the poetry workshop at the Santa Barbara Writers Conference, convincing them that I was not the right person.
Right.
And
how many years has it been now?
I've been doing it since 1984.
And I don't know if people realize what that means, because that's quite
it means I'm old.
Well, besides that, that it's a very prestigious thing. And to be doing that year after year after year and doing the wonderful job that you do is really amazing. And I just do want to say one more thing, is that Perie and I met through the profession of poetry therapy, and I was quite interested in learning more about that and getting certified. And Perie became my mentor, and what can I say? I mean, she brought me into just about everything I know, really, and helped me just grow up in so many ways. And we've shared so much over the years. And so you're kind of a sister, really. It's just wonderful to see you here shining so brightly, and to hear your amazing poetry. And I'm so glad that you have a chance to be heard,
Thank you.
and given the chance to give us your words.
Thank you so much. It means so much to hear some of the words that you said, and we go way back, and you have become an amazing poet yourself.
Oh, thank you.
And very, very established and awarded.
Thank you.
I'll tell you my favorite award I ever got. It was from my granddaughter when she was, I don't know, she was probably about 8. And she drew a picture of me like on a rag paper. And there was my head and arms and legs, okay. And this is award for my Yaya. She is the poet of the century. And it was spelled Sentry. That's I'll put that on my headstone, poet of the century.
Somebody's got to guard the gate, Perie.
What's that?
I say somebody's got to guard the gate. Somebody's got
That's
to be the
right.
poet for
That's
the
right.
century.
Is there anyone else?
Well, okay, I
Yes,
just
Myrna.
briefly to say that your poetry doesn't just touch and it's deep, but the versatility of your subjects and the treatments of those subjects is really amazing. I mean, you go seemingly so effortlessly from emotionally charged poem, which is touching, and it's touching in its simplicity, not because of any fanciness, it just speaks to me. And then you go and write something like that conversation with you said, he said, and whoever else said, and stuff like that. It's just amazing. I really want to thank you for this. It's been delightful to hear this.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to know that you felt that way. Thank you. Sometimes I think I just have to find my voice. I think I'm still trying to find my voice, right? So you just work with whatever food you have. And
Absolutely, I hear you, Perie. Well then, thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts and your comments in the chat as well. The lines you've posted in relation to the poetry prompt that Perie offered us at the beginning of tonight's session, we will collate them into a community poem and share it with all of you later by email. Perie, once again, I'm grateful for your time and for everything you shared tonight. It was an absolute delight to have you as my featured artist, and I hope you can stay with us for the open mic and to offer a closing poem at the end of it.
right, I absolutely will stay with you, but I might go off video so I can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I can
Please
see.
feel free.
Thank you so much, everyone, and Monica for inviting me. I had fun.
That's all I want to hear, Perie. Thanks a lot. All right. With that, we are going to stop recording this segment. Those of you who are in the Zoom room, please stay online for the open mic segment of the evening. To the YouTube audience, thanks for tuning in and hope to see you for next month's virtual Belmont Poetry Night. Good night.